Okay.
Okay, guys, welcome. Welcome to the fourth session of Seasons on Saturday. And we're going to continue to examine the story of the Four Seasons and the catalogue of the Four Seasons to line it up with the release this summer of the whole catalogue by Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons on Snapper Records. And we're also going to use these sessions to debunk the Jersey Boys myth as much as we can.
Oh my goodness!
What we know. So we're going to go for it. So tonight we have with us Lee Shapiro, we have Anthony Colatrella, we have Mike Derrico, we have Chuck Walker, and we also have our host and engineer Mark Chalmer, who's assisting me.
I can't work with that guy. He's very, very, confrontational.
He's a good boy for his
He
day.
is.
So the last few sessions have dealt with the early years of VJ, and we will to some extent return to those because the story of VJ isn't finished at the point we broke off, because last time we touched on the dispute with VJ and the near breakup of the group as Bob Crew, he owned the name, and they were suing him and he was suing VJ. And the dispute was going on with Genius Inc., which was Bob and Dan Crew's company. And by 63, they hadn't recorded since the Ain't That a Shame album, which we talked about last time. And as the box set is built on albums, we're going to work through the albums, but the thing that I'm going to bring home, and we'll all talk about this in the open discussion, is that the Four Seasons were a singles group. And that was what Bob Crew set them as. So the albums, to some extent, are side issues. It's about what they did on singles and how they were hits or not. Now, Bob and the group agreed by mid 63 that the legal dispute was going to take a while. They needed to get back in the studio. They needed to create music again. And Charlie was threatening to walk away from Bob Crew altogether as a arranger. And so rather than that happen, obviously to make some money, they decided that they'd have a go. And Bob Gaudio came up with the song Dawn, which was a ballad. And as we know, it was a slow ballad. And Charlie gave the Mundo treatment.
You got to mention Sandy Linzer.
Sandy Linzer wrote it with Bob Gaudio. Thank you for reminding me. And they went into Atlantic Studio on the 10th of January 1964 and recorded two songs, Dawn and No Surfing Today. And Atlantic boss Ahmed Ertegun wanted to sign them, and the reasons why they didn't sign to Atlantic are not fully known, but in his book, Charlie maybe diplomatically says that maybe it was because Tommy was pushing because he wanted this time to own the masters, which they didn't do at VJ. And so I would tend to believe that sort of pressure worked with the group and worked with Bob Crew, and they said, yeah, we'll go with Philips, who are a relatively unknown record company in America, but which had basically established a reputation in Europe. And so Dawn hit the Four Seasons fans. And how different in terms of structure and arrangement was it, Lee, to their previous efforts?
Well, let me just say this, because I know this firsthand. And it's interesting that you bring up this, because this is one of the older things where, like in 64, I was 11. But because of my relationship with Frankie, I know so much of this stuff. And for some reason, I remember it. The song, as you say, Ken, was a ballad, and it was a folk ballad. Dawn, jang, jang, go away. And Frankie, it's just unbelievable. But nonetheless, the guy keeps having the right idea. Frankie comes in and says he wants to do a Pres Prado thing and starts banging on his thighs with his hands. Tick, tick, tack, tick, tack, tick, tack, the galloping beat. And that's why it's there. And all of the chimes and signature sounds, that's all Charlie. Bang, 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 bang. That's all Charlie. And pretty as a midsummer morn. That's Sandy. Now the rest of it is Gaudio. And there you have it.
Yeah, and Crew, well,
And Crew is a genius, always was.
Crew just saw everything coming together and held it together.
Crew made you feel that it was a hit. No matter what it was, when you were with Crew, whatever you were working on felt like a hit. It was him, and he didn't play an instrument. It was unbelievable.
So when Phillips put it out, of course,
Ted, can we get a clarification?
Yeah.
My understanding has always been that Dawn was recorded the original version of Dawn was recorded in November of '63 with several other songs that the Four Seasons did on their own and some songs that they did with other groups like the Forevers. Is that not correct?
No, that's not true. That's not true. Well, it might have been recorded in November. I might have got the date wrong on that. I took it from some notes that somebody had done, and I took it on. But yeah, but the songs with the Forevers and the other songs that were done with Larry Sampras were all done earlier, in 1963, and so the session for Dawn was a specific 2-song session.
Okay.
Crew set up, and so it instantly hit the market. Obviously, there was another major group making waves at the moment. So going round to talk to you guys, what was the impact? I mean, you were in New Jersey, Anthony.
Yeah.
And
About Dawn, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. When I first heard that, I wasn't sure it was the Four Seasons. I could recognize Frankie's voice, but certainly the song was of an entirely different style to me. There wasn't the traditional or the usual sort of clap march, almost like.
Well, Anthony also was the departure from the doo-wop influence.
Yeah.
Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, Walk Like a Man had a very strong doo-wop influence. And when the track was made for Dawn, that was the first departure from not doing dun 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 dun. But oddly enough, and just as an addendum, those are the chords to "Who Loves You," which is what brought the band back. Yeah. So anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to
Chuck. You were on the other coast experiencing.
No, the West Coast. I lived in the Northwest in Portland. We had a Formula radio station. For those of you that are not from the U.S., a Formula radio station was one that they played basically 30 or 40 records in cycle. And they didn't play anything else. So if it wasn't a hit, it didn't get played.
But how did it get played?
Christmas of '63, the day before Christmas or the day after Christmas, the Capitol people got to them, and every other song they played was "I Want to Hold Your Hand." So all of January '64, the only thing you heard on the radio was "I Want to Hold Your Hand."
Well, the only thing you heard on the radio in '62, thanks to Joey Reynolds in New York,
was Sherry.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but this was typical of what they did in Portland at the time, and some of the secondary radio stations played other stuff. And I don't remember if I heard Dawn on the other stations or heard it on Kissin' first, but it was a reach out. I had basically given up on the Four Seasons because I hadn't heard anything from them since Candy Girl Marlena that was any good. And Dawn was just a totally different sound. And it combined the instrumentation. And I also at that time really liked more Mondo Khan, the Kay Winding version.
Yeah. And
it sounded a lot like that. But in looking back, as we've talked about this the last couple of days.
Wait a minute, Charles, very astute observation. Mondo Kani Moore is the same rhythm as Dawn. So well noticed.
Well, that was intentional, right?
Yes.
They specifically wanted that type of galloping rhythm.
Frankie has spoken to this actually.
It was Frankie's coaxing. Frankie's coaxing made that happen.
But I'm not I don't read music or understand music, but looking back as I compare Dawn and I Want to Hold Your Hand, there's a lot of similarities in the beats of the two. And I'm wondering if there was any, since it was recorded in January, if there was any similarities or takeoffs.
It was all about your first idea. It was all about that Frankie liked that dunk dunk thing. He just had it in his head and he thought that it would work. And of course, it worked.
Well, it did change the sound totally. And Mike, you caught up with this at a later date, but you noticed that difference, don't you?
Yeah, well, Frankie has actually spoken to this. Frankie, being the frustrated drummer that he has described himself as, heard more. He wanted something that sounded like more, that rolling, as he has described it, that rolling sound. But ironically, it's one of the only 60s hits that where the first sound we hear is not a drum.
And that became a signature throughout his whole career.
Unless we cut out the intro, right?
But
the intro.
Most of those opens were co-written with Sandy. Let's Hang On. Every time you hear that, it's Sandy, except for probably the most played hit, and that's Beggin'. And that's Put Your Loving Hand Out, Baby, I'm begging.
Yeah,
that's
the only that's a revisit of the same style of lead into a song. Yeah,
but it happened about
we'll come
5 or 6 hits, Kenny. There are about 5 or 6 hits that have that open kind of, I've been a searching all this great wide world. Finally, I found my, I mean, it's just unbelievable.
It's either that or a drum. Cherry, Big Girl Song, like the initial hits.
Well, Ragdoll
start with some sort of a drum.
Well, of course, we'll come to Ragdoll when we get to that album. Well, the hits tend to lead the album, so we cover the hits. But of course, Dawn was sort of sidelined to number 3 by the Beatles at the time, and we know the story of the Beatles, Swamp in America, and I will pick up on that a little bit later. But Philip's reaction to it was, we must get an album out, and we must get it out on a folky album. And I think Chuck may have highlighted to me in notes that they were pushing the Serendipity Singers and other people who were very folky at the time, and Born to Wander became the album that they wanted to push first. And it only contained a handful of Bob Gaudio folky ballads, and the rest of cover versions and other things.
The band, as you said, the band was always a singles group, and that was a bane in Gaudio's existence. He wanted, and that's frankly why Who Loves You wasn't, as in my opinion it should have been, developed into the next Who Loves You and that kind of album. Instead, he wanted to be like the Grateful Dead and be on WNEW in New York. And honestly, look, creative people make great decisions and bad decisions. That one was the...
Well, they did promote the album, because we have picked up in the box set the earliest reasonable board recording of them doing 4 songs in a 1964 performance, just as Dawn was hitting. The final song is Dawn. The opening song is Since I Don't Have You, from their VJ days. They've got Cry Myself to Sleep in there as well. And so when you hear that medley of songs on this box set, I mean, it is just, the incredible thing about it was the sound they produced on stage, and how Frankie's voice was the instrument that you've told us it was.
At the live Clearwater, Florida concert.
You heard that in Florida?
The live, Clearwater, Florida concert.
Well, no, it's not the Clearwater, Florida concert that we've got.
No, I know.
It's another one. It's another one.
That was, they used those songs in.
Yeah, they did.
Also
they did
in that concert.
Yeah, this was another performance, and I don't know where, because it comes from Tommy DeVito's cassette. And that cassette was given to Rex Woodard when he was writing the book with Tommy, that eventually became the support for Jersey Boys. And he sent a tape over of all his collected early days recordings, live and otherwise, including full other stuff. And I was able to salvage that set and send it to the engineer, and hopefully he's going to make it into an incredible sounding set on this CD. But it shows you that, it showed me that they could produce the sound live. And that was the amazing thing about them in '64. They were an amazing live group. Anthony, you saw them, didn't you?
Yes, they were. People always ask me, and I always say, in Where I came from, you rated groups as to how they sounded live, not how they sounded on a record. And, you know, everyone would say, oh, they don't sound as good live. But then when I heard the Four Seasons, my God, they sounded exactly like they sounded on the, I mean, give or take, you know, the richness of the sound musically. But
Yeah.
when they performed on stage, it was just them singing into mics with their guitars, and they had a couple of amplifiers. That was it. And
Yeah,
yet
but Anthony, back then, your judgment was based on a pure
It was a mono
concept.
record. Mono record.
Just saying, he was, in other words, whatever you thought that was exactly, believe me, it wasn't. But what was exactly is when you got Frankie, Bobby, Tom, and Nikki, and they, wherever they sang, they were them. So
Right.
they could have walked out with no instruments and sang in a cappella show, and you'd have been entertained because it really was them. And one last note, when I was doing my Hitman thing and we were playing all of our hits from the seasons, it took two of us. All of Frankie's vocals are doubled on records, but when Frankie sings not doubled live, he sounds fabulous because it's him. We couldn't do, we had Jimmy and Larry Gates, the late Larry Gates. They both sang in unison Frankie's part, and it sounded like Frankie's record, but no one could make that sound live other than Frankie.
No, Charlie has said that the sound of the Four Seasons and the individual vocals was quite unique. And because they were singing beyond their range, they were always stretching themselves, and they created a quite unique vocal harmony. Which,
not to mention Nick Massey's uneducated, unschooled, innate ability to voice. They weren't afraid to do things that other people weren't doing. Everybody was doing things in three-part harmony, C, E, G, a chord. They opened it up and put the third on the bottom and the sixth in the middle. And I'm sure that it was all, I'm positive it was all done by ear, because I worked with Nicky on the Hickory stuff. And I saw how he worked, you know, because I was a kid, but it was quite amazing. Everything was in his head before we even start. You sing this, you sing this. And if I write it out, it's quite different than anything else going on, which is why when you see a tribute band and they don't do the right voicing, you hate it.
Well, this is why we don't promote tribute bands unless they are top notch. And
Chuck,
I had a chance to see the group in March of 1964 in an auditorium, and there was the four guys, and Ronald Roach was playing the drums behind them. And they sounded, based upon what we were getting in the Northwest at that time, they sounded pretty good. They sounded a lot better than most of the surf groups that we had. And what impressed me the most was not Frankie, but Nick Massey. Nick Massey's voice came across very clear in the songs he said.
Yeah, he was an instant blend, because he had "Silly Girl," that sound blended beautifully. And also part of the magic is that they weren't trained singers, any of them. So they really were the street corner guys everyone
it was
talked
a raw
about.
edge. Charlie said that there was a raw edge to them, because they were singing at the top of their range, or you know, as non-singers singing, they'd trained themselves to sing and work together on harmonies for a number of years.
Not only that, standing around a piano with Frankie and Gaudio, I can tell you that we would do a song and Gaudio would say, "Bring it up a half step." And Frankie would say, "Come on, man, I'm already on a high A." So bring it up a half step. And Gaudio would be the guy to push it, and son of a gun. If you listen to Who Loves You, everybody's way in the stratosphere, Don especially. And it sounds great.
Yeah. And the only surprise that's left over from this Born to Wander, you know, preliminary album, is that we found that they were going to put a song into an Italian song festival. And we found a copy of that recording, which actually appears on the Born to Wander album, but without the falsetto overdub. And the song is called Millie.
Millie, yeah.
And it's sung in a straight harmony style.
Like it's really not like the others. It's not. I wouldn't consider that a folk song, really. It's more of a.
It was more of a pop song. They were going to put it in a pop festival in Italy.
Right.
It never happened, but the song, we found the alternative master of that. But straight away, Phillips wanted a follow-on, and Charlie spoke to me and told me that in an earlier conversation I had with him, that they repeated the formula, which Lee has said to us before in the earlier discussions. That's what you need to do. they took the structure and the formula for Dawn and they put it into Ronnie.
Mhm.
And they
You know,
got
I read somewhere that that song was actually supposed to be recorded by one of Bob Cruz's female singers, but she rejected it. I don't know if that's true or a true story or not.
never heard that, Anthony. That's
Yeah,
new.
Ronnie, it was supposed to be sung by a female singer. She didn't like the song, so the Four Seasons
Oh,
said, "Well, we'll
It
record
could
it."
only have been somebody like Dan Renee.
No, it was Tracy Day. Tracy Day.
Tracy Day, yeah.
Ron as a song, Ronnie is to me one of the cleverest
Yeah.
chordal progressions and direction and just the whole thing, even where the bridge falls, and it just nothing has anything to do with conventional structure of a pop song, none of it, and I love it.
Yeah, when you just hear it played like on a piano, just I mean, the melody is it's just so beautiful melody.
Well, I just released my second CD, to do a little plug, and it has Ronnie on it.
Yeah.
And I will tell you though that when you hear "I'll go on living," and you know the song, for 1 second, 2 seconds, you know the song, and that was their success. Not only great records, not only great singing and Cruz magical productions, and Charlie's charts, but the fact of the matter is, when they had a hit, you knew it was them immediately. And
That was the
honestly,
other thing. They tended to begin the song with a chorus instead
usually
of a verse.
until such a time as Sandy got involved, and then Gaudio followed suit, and they all started with these beginning things, even instrumentally, like "Under My Skin," where Artie wrote that little piano part and orchestrated that. Nobody started a song like that. There's one thing about Gaudio, and he obviously learned it from Crew, because Crew was that way too, and that is, and today people are afraid of it, that's why everything sounds the same today, is because those two guys were like, well, I don't care, this is what I want to do. I have a deal and they want me to be creative, so I'm going to be, as opposed to, we better do something that they like, we better.
Yeah, Charlie
didn't come to that. They didn't succumb
Charlie
to
said
it.
that. Charlie said that. He said, Crew would ask me to do something, and I'd say, you can't do that, Bob. It just doesn't work. And he said, well, if you don't do it, Charlie, somebody else will.
Someone else, yeah.
They used to do edits where they would want to. They used to do edits where they would want to put the front half of the song on the back of the song as well. However, by then the key had changed, and I was there. Kalala would say, "You can't edit the front onto the end because it's an E and now we're an F." And Gaudio or Crew would say, "Who cares?" They said, "Who cares?" because they didn't understand what it implied. On the other hand, they did the edit that worked beautifully pretty much every time he wanted to do it.
Well, they were doing that. They were coming to the peak of the creative art,
Yes.
and the team was coming together progressively as we moved through this period, because they were competing against obviously the best band in the world at that time, and some would say of all time,
Ever.
in the Beatles, and they had to compete. So the way forward was they must have realised, because of the Northern Songs connection and all the songs that the Beatles had written, that they were getting publishing, as well as performing. So it seemed to be the way people were going at that time. So they started to write more material themselves. And obviously with Sandy coming in, Charlie said to me that at certain stages, Bob Gaudio was running dry in terms of composing. And he needed a collaborator. He always seemed to need a collaborator.
The best collaborating team of the entire era of 60 years is Crew and Gaudio.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I mean, they all wrote songs with other people and they were all great and they all had big hits, and I'm very impressed and honored to have been a part of their world. But Crew and Gaudio, it was ridiculous. They couldn't do something wrong. And even when they did, you thought it was a hit.
Well, they even wrote some songs that they didn't get released, but we'll get to that when we get to that point in their career. At this time, and in terms of what's left in the Four Seasons archive, we have what we have. But what we've had to do is cement onto the albums the actual mono single mixes, because Crew mixed them differently. He mixed them with a faster, harder edge.
well, not only that, Kenny, what sold, what mattered was, and this lasted all the way up until probably the end of the 70s. What mattered was how it sounded coming out of a car radio. That's what mattered. From the 60s on, for 30 years, if it didn't sound good, and the reason it all sounded good, and then you'd buy the record and you'd have the drums on the left and something, because everybody was in love with the new stereo. But what made a hit was the amount of compression that was put on those records to play them through. And no matter what the mix was, it all sounded great. So you got the record home, and then it just sounded, you remembered it, but it was a touch different. But the compression was the whole thing. And notoriously, in the interest of having more time to sell product for their advertisers, they would speed each of the songs up just a little time.
Just a little.
And by the time the hour went by, they had another minute for a commercial.
Well, I've said, I counted up that I spent over 2,000 hours researching this, the tracks for this box set, and trying to find everything and make sure they were the original. So not only have we the mono albums, which should be the original mono mix, but we've even got the alternative mono mixes as bonus tracks that were the actual 45 mixes, where they're different, because there were different takes sometimes and different mixes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but also the speed up thing, if everybody got used to Dawn at the speed that it was on the radio, it was just a fraction. But you still kind of, you kind of felt it, at least if, for me, I could A/B it. I was doing it with it.
Well, I'll come to some of the tracks.
There was another issue on the radio at that time too. It was called 3 minutes. If a record was over 3 minutes, nobody'd play it because they didn't have enough time for their commercials.
2.5 minutes.
Except for Hey Jude.
Well, that was a bit later.
That was a bit later in time.
Yeah, it was, but that was the one that really broke the mold, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think
American
Rolling
Pie.
Stone.
there's a lot of things that broke the mold between the 64. I don't know how old you all were in 64, but I was sort of 17, 18, and everything was breaking, everything was coming out, everything was going in different directions, and the creative elements of the 60s were at the peak in terms of not only music, but in terms of social fashion and the freedom of teenagers to express themselves. That was the UK as an explosion of youth, and Mark knows about this. We've talked about it many times, but I don't know whether you experienced and felt that in America the same.
Yeah, sure.
Can I just add something here?
Definitely.
I listened to the Serendipity singers this morning, and they're dreadful. And I mean, there must be such a contrast. They're just really ploddy weird folk music.
Yeah, they weren't even that good of a folk group, to tell you.
Yeah, and it just struck me that the modernity of what came in with
the Beatles. The Beatles inspired it. Phil Spector inspired it. The Beatles inspired it. Bob Crewe was doing what he was doing with the Seasons, and then gradually Brian Wilson caught up and took over, and the whole explosion of, and Motown was happening as well. So we had this amazing period, and obviously the Bob Crewe and Bob Gaudio, and now with Sandy Lindsay, we're trying to compete. And we know that there's a story behind the Ragdoll album, and I won't have us discuss that there. It's detailed out in the box set collection exactly how that happened, and we know they used borrowed instruments and they went in for a cheap session, and Bob Gaudio had it all planned out in his head and implemented it, and whilst it wasn't perfect in terms of recording, they did it as a demo, it is said. It was so good when they balanced the sound out and put the echo on it that it was the competition with Spector and anything the Spector did.
Frankie Valli told me 15 years ago, 12 years ago, when I was in the studio with him for his fortunately last album. But in any case, he said to me, Lee, you know what I miss? I miss the days where the rule was, if it feels good, it's good. Whereas today it's absolute neurosurgery.
Well, you
And
have
a
to do
lot,
it in 3 hours. You had to
a
do it
lot
in
of
3
them,
hours, Lee, didn't you?
Mhm.
You had to do it in 3 hours.
oh yeah. And well, the Ramones recorded an entire album in an hour. The whole thing. Here we go. Okay, 1, 2, 3. You know, that's it. It's a different style, obviously. But what I'm saying to you is that part of it is right. If it felt good, it was good. If you listen to the very end of, I think it's Foxy Lady by Jimi Hendrix, and Noel Redding on bass is literally in the wrong part of the song as it fades out. He's playing the chorus against it. It's wrong. It clashed. Who cares? The whole thing was great up to them. We're going to use this take, and that was the attitude. And it didn't hold up because what was possible started. In other words, what you could do started to overcome what you should do, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, some of the technical issues with trying to salvage Ragdoll from the Four Seasons partnership, a couple of things that I found was that the stereo copy that had been salvaged was slightly damaged, and there's a dropout of 15 seconds in. So searching around for another copy of it took days and days. But eventually we did find that we've got an immaculate mono, we've got an immaculate stereo. And if that hadn't been done now, the Four Seasons wouldn't have the catalogue that they're going to have. So Ragdoll, the album, with all the great original songs on it, became a massive hit for them, number 7 in the charts, and really stood up to what the Beatles were doing at that time in '64. And they were outstanding.
There was a time in the mid 60s, I think it was, when the top 10 was 3 songs by the Beatles, 2 songs by the Four Seasons, 1 song by Frankie, and a couple by the Beach Boys. That was the top 10. Maybe a Motown song in there.
Yeah.
But that was kind of it. That everybody else was less than top 10 because of those entities.
Well, there was a day in April '64 when the Beatles occupied the top 5 positions on the Billboard chart. And so we know the impact they had. But to have the success of what, I mean, I'll have to ask Mike, of the albums in the '60s, Mike, I think, and I think Anthony and Chuck probably think, Ragdoll was definitely the best, most challenging album. I bought it straight away, and I've loved it ever since. What do you think?
Of their best of the '60s?
Yeah.
I think we're gonna have to go with the next episode when
we'll go with the next
into the Joe Long period.
You see the benefit of them writing songs and
absolutely, yeah,
the formula, yeah, on
yes.
Ragdoll. It certainly
absolutely.
But then they went on to do an album at Philips called Entertain You in early 1965. And they really dropped off the pace of what they'd done before because they were doing Broadway show tunes.
Frankie always wanted to be Frank Sinatra or Vic Damone. And
yeah.
frankly, he always wanted to be, and honestly, in the last 20 years, he's achieved it. But prior to that, we were doing club songs and Broadway songs instead of Candy Girl.
He did somewhere on the Entertain You album, you know, Where Is Love? You know, these are songs that we didn't think the Four Seasons could ever do. And the only thing was Frankie could carry anything.
Entertain You also had Sunday Kind of Love, which is tremendous.
Yeah, which was a reversal to the doo-wop days. So
exactly, but it was that whole bit was Frankie driven. That was his dream, and maybe his one, you know, kink in his armor.
But they were making a mess of. We then created a formula, and then they were making a mess of it.
That's the problem.
Yes.
Entertain You was a catch-all for trying to be everything to everybody.
Yeah, it was.
You can't do it. It just doesn't work.
No, and of course, what did they do then? I mean, Frankie. Frankie moved on to trying to be a solo artist, and Phillips wouldn't let him. So Bob Crew took him to Atlantic Studios and recorded The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore and released it on the Smash label in mid '65. And lack of promotion, whatever, it didn't work.
It was as good as the Walker Brothers.
Ken, you just stumbled on my mantra with the Seasons, and I'll always bring it up. It's lack of promotion across the board. Every label they were on,
Yeah.
Lack of promotion. That is the fatal flaw, this tragic flaw running through their entire history.
Yeah.
Is lack of promotion.
But Mike, the record companies were lazy with them because they could conceivably spontaneously combust and have a huge hit, and it's like, okay, good, well, and then they would develop someone else because they knew the seasons would be okay, and they weren't. They needed the same attention.
But the difference between the Beatles and the Beach Boys to some extent is they weren't controlled by the record company, or they didn't go off on a strange one with Bob Crewe when he made a silly decision, and they decided to do, as a result of Bob Crewe's instigation, big hits of Bacharach and Dylan. And Charlie said to me, he says, I can't understand why we did that. It always seemed wrong to me. Yeah, we went in the studio and did it, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel as though we connected with these people who listened to Dylan and Bacharach. We were a pop group doing live shows of up-tempo happy hits.
Except for the Wonder Who.
And that only created one track that went to the charts. And that was, the Wonder Who. But they had 3 top 10 hits under 3 different names in the year, I think.
All correct.
Yeah. And so they were positioned well to do well as they came to the middle of 1965. They did that rather strange album, which is dismissed by many people. But then Nick Massey decided to leave, and
Nick Massey left because he couldn't get along with Tommy.
Yeah. Well,
That's not what Charlie says.
it also has been said that Frankie Valli was stealing his. Yeah. And Charlie has made that comment to me personally. But what happened on the road, we know about that from the Jersey Boy story. You had a road family and you had a real family, and that was the way things were at the time. But they didn't get on, and they roomed together. And yeah, Nick had a lot of pressure on him from his family, and but I think he felt they'd done enough. Do you think he thought that? That they'd done enough? He didn't need.
I do. I think that ultimately it was like, he had. I think that he would be a guy who would lean towards the pressure of his family to be with him. Beyond, there's a lot of let's call it ethnic, cultural pressure in that world in that time, and I would bet that if he was getting home pressure, he would leave just because of that.
Yeah.
However,
I think so.
But there was more than that. And enter Joe Long, which you'll go into when you're ready, Ken.
Yeah.
But for me, and I spoke to Joe 2 days before he passed on a FaceTime of all things. He picked it up in the hospital. I couldn't believe it. Yeah. And but Nicky was the sound. Joe was close, and Joe did it, and he carried the ball beautifully.
They changed. They said they changed the way they did the vocals slightly with Joe there.
Slightly is the word, because Joe didn't have the richness in the low end. But be that as it may, and I've made this statement to Frankie, I was one of the Four Seasons, but to me, the Four Seasons are Nick, Tommy, Frankie, and Bob. That's the Four Seasons. And I was one of the four, but I'm proud to have been the new guard. But really, man, Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, Can't Take My Eyes Off You. What? That's the Four. I love Who Loves You Another Night, and we are the Four Seasons. But you know what I'm saying, Kenny.
I know what you're saying. But when we don't see it that way, I'm sorry, Lee. We see a number of Four Seasons, and ever since the 70s and right the way through to the 90s, you've got to look at one thing, and that is we manage the Four Seasons UK Appreciation Society. And they're called the Four Seasons UK Appreciation Society because there were a lot more people than just the original Four Seasons behind what we got. There was Bob Crewe, there was Charlie Colello, there was Sandy Lynn, there was Denny Randell, and everybody who followed as a musician that created a sound that we could all relate to, is part of the catalogue. And this is what's celebrated in the catalogue. It's everybody's contribution.
I'm not minimizing, the 70s version, but the thing that made, the thing that lit my eyes up is when I heard Under My Skin.
Yeah.
That Never Wins. I must have played that record.
John Piver did as well. He said, I'd love to be part of that group. He told me that way back when we first started.
That record was monumental. And the way they did it, they only did it as an homage to Sinatra.
Well, they had to do something. I'll come to that in a future session because
I'll let you run with it.
It's in the next part. Because when mid-65, you got to remember they were still in dispute. They'd broken contract to go to Philips. They were in breach of contract. They were in dispute with VJ, and settlement in late 65 was on the basis of royalties, that they would get royalties from VJ if they supplied another album and a single, and they supplied craftily what they had on tape, and that was something that they had decided not to put out, which was the live on stage sessions from 1962, which were rehearsals for the Copacabana, and Bob Crew overdubbed audience onto that, and it came out in 1965 as a Four Seasons live on stage. Well, I didn't hear it at the time, but I was amazed when I did hear it. But Little Boy in Grown Up Clothes was the only pop song that they came up with, and we believe, but we do not know, we think it was recorded either in 63 at the end of VJ, but I don't think so. I think it's more likely they recorded it as a one-off, as part of the Bye Bye Baby sessions in 1965. What do you guys think?
It's not impossible that some of the rifts and some of the bad eventualities and all things that happen with the group, with lack of promotion, as Mike said, it's not impossible that Frankie and Bobby could alienate a few people. It's not impossible that they could be a little.
Well, the same applies to Bob Crew. The same applies to Bob Crew.
But I'm just saying. But you know what's interesting? That would never apply to me, and I didn't have that kind of success. The bottom line is sometimes.
Well,
geez, I don't mean to ruffle your feathers. Like, what can we do to compromise? These guys weren't that way at all. No, it's going to be my way, and I'm going to fail, or I'm going to succeed. One of the two.
Your mantra for me and for life is: love is the answer, kindness is the key.
That is my.
Yeah, and that didn't necessarily apply in the music business in the mid-60s.
It doesn't apply to anybody except those that decide to pick it up and enhance their lives and other people's lives.
But the settlement in late 65 required that, and at that time, VJ was still flooding the market with old VJ stuff. And so this album came out, didn't have any success, and nor did the promotion. But the problem was that they reached a point in late 65 where at least they had settled that dispute, but they'd lost Nick Massey. And if that wasn't a panic button moment, what was? Charlie was the only one they could call on to help them out.
Yeah.
And as always,
well, they didn't.
Charlie did.
They called on Loser and Ragdoll.
Yeah, and and they were fortunate at the same time that Denny Randell had. Well, of course, Charlie had spotted Sandy Lindsay and brought him into the fold, and he also spotted Denny Randell and introduced him to Bob Gaudio as well. And so the team was complete in many ways, but they'd suddenly lost a member of the team in Nick. So they had to do the Working My Way Back to You album without Nick. And I'm not sure what the last song that Nick sang on. Was it Let's Hang On? Or was that? Yeah, that was the last Nick Massey vocal. And well, that was pulled together. It was an imitation of the Motown sound that they came up with. And Charlie was given it in the studio. The Four Seasons were running around the country recording live. And as Charlie told us, he had to put together the arrangement and do everything. And they just came in for the day and recorded it. Then the next day, Bob Cruz said, why don't we have an intro? Here we are again. And the intro was, what we all know. We need those intros, don't we?
Love
And
the
you know that I
intro.
think I've told
love
this.
the intro.
I joined the band. They opened the show with Dawn without the intro, and
Yeah.
my first order of business was to put the intro back in for the opening, and we did.
So how could the Four Seasons ever have a hit without "There Ain't No Good in Our Goodbye"?
And wait, Ken, when I joined, they weren't doing that either. They were just kicking it off with the down, 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 down. I was adamant, and I was a little boy, and I said, Frankie, those are the best parts of the song. I love those parts of the song. You got to put, and I can take a little credit for having been some of the impetus to get them back in.
If you remember, there were years, entire tours that went by where "Let's Hang On" was part of a medley.
Yeah.
It was just thrown into a medley.
As
Always.
was many of the songs that
Yes.
a lot of
Right.
songs. A lot of songs were good to be in a medley, like "Will You Love Me Tomorrow" and whatever the one was. There's one song that was like a mild hit. We did those two together. But you should never put Ronnie in a medley and not be able to go, "I'll go on living." It's sacrilege, man. It's like singing the Star Spangled Banner without the rocket's red glare.
I want to cut in really quick. The part you just quoted, this is the second time you quoted that today. I think if I had to isolate the greatest 10 seconds of the Four Seasons at the end, it happens in the last few seconds of Ronnie, that fade out. If I had to isolate everything the Four Seasons are about to me in terms of the sound, in terms of what they, in terms of everything they were, happens in the last 10 seconds of that song. That's just my opinion.
Wait, from the modulation out. From the
Yeah.
modulation. Because they go, "I'll go on living and keep on beginning because you were my first love."
And when the falsetto comes in, the high note that he hits, that's just
Right.
like, to me, that's like the greatest 5 or 6 seconds in their recorded history. But again, that's just my opinion.
There are many anthemic closings, and we skip by "Bye Bye Baby," and
Another one.
we
That's a
have a,
good intro.
we have a constant complaint from people saying, why did they never do that properly in concert? And it's because they used the build-up and they did the anthemic ending, which brought the crowd to its feet.
All right.
And they started doing that. I'm not sure when they started doing it that way, but
Always.
once
Always.
they did it, always.
I joined the band in '73. The arrangement of that without the beginning of "Bye Bye Baby," where they used it for the close, Kenny, had been in for 6 years, 7 years. I mean, literally.
That came
was-
in, I would say that was in the later 60s. When they
Yes.
first were doing that, the big three, and then finishing with "Bye Bye Baby."
Well,
The unfortunate thing,
they always finish that way, yeah.
yes, and so did the Hitmen. But the unfortunate thing is, it worked so well. Always, it brought
Yeah.
people to their feet as soon as you went. Bah, bah. They were going nuts. No one had the good. No one wanted this. You couldn't. You can't change something that works that good. It's sacrilege. You don't touch it. And yet, I heard Robbie's set of guys, and they did the whole thing with the beginning, and it died. It died. It's a great thing, but unless it's placed right, or you start the song at the beginning because you're doing the song,
Well,
just
this is why the original recordings, the very original recordings, have to be preserved. But they also had "Girl Come Running," which is an amazing song, and I absolutely love. But it was such a minor hit. I've never heard it done live.
Chuck brought that up. I heard them do it live. Matter of fact, it was like in '65 at a concert, and they said, "This is our new single," and they sang it. I had heard it one time on the radio before the concert, and again, it sounded exactly like the record. So people say, "Oh, he couldn't hit those high notes live." He did. It was sounded exactly like the record.
Oh yes,
Totally underrated. Totally underrated.
yeah. No, even at my audition, and he stepped up to me and sang. It was him. There was nothing. It was amazing. There's only one guy. You'll always know what that sounds like.
Yeah. So we had great hits in early '65. We had crap albums in "Entertain You" and Bacharach and Dylan. But when we got to "Working My Way Back to You," wow, that
Sandy,
stands.
Sandy was back.
Yeah, but the whole album has got some fantastic songs on it. You know, I mean, Nick Massey wrote "Living Just for You," and it's just an amazing song. You know, "Can't Get Enough of You, Baby," which was written and recorded by the Toys. There are many tracks on that album that make it a classic album, but they were running into problems at that time. I discovered they were running into problems at recording at Stay Phillips because they were getting distortion on the recordings. They had to work so hard to get that done and that album out. But Charlie did, I think, 8 out of the 12 tracks as a Four Season on that album. And it's worth studying in its own right as an album, a classic album in the whole catalogue. But that was it. They had the first loss in Nick. And then as they moved into, and of course the Beatles were doing amazing stuff at the time with Rubber Soul, and then they were going to follow that with Revolver, and the Four Seasons were competing against this. You needed a top writing team to do that. In early 1966, Opus 17 was written by
Lindsay Randell.
And that really re-cemented them as a hit single group. And then the two guys disappeared.
Listen, Kenny, you couldn't compete with the Beatles for a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is that they had gotten themselves to the place where they could do whatever they wanted, and it was a hit. And the hits, every song it's the only group in the history of the world where every album, if you tell me an album title, I can sing you every song, all 12 tracks, whatever it is, on every album. And I'm not in the minority, but it's like they're the best thing that ever was as far as a quartet that played and sang and write. I don't think it'll ever be topped, just like I don't think there'll be another.
No, but you know, their 13th single, Paperback Writer, didn't get to number 1. You know, so.
But it was
that is a record that they've never lived down. You know.
No, but they had double-sided hits just like the Seasons did.
They did, and Rain.
Day Tripper.
Rain was the first venture.
There'll never be another Beatles, ever, never. And I love the Stones for all different reasons, but the Beatles is the epitome of musical expression in pop music ever.
So the Four Seasons were trying to emulate Motown and did the Working My Way Back to You album and had a big hit, and we're getting plenty of tour. We're making money touring, with Joe Long having ably stepped in and performed brilliantly. And then after Opus 17, Denny and Sandy were forced out because they complained to Crew over royalties. They wanted bigger slice of the pie, and they signed allegedly for another label, and Bob Crew immediately sacked them. Now that's the story I've heard.
They split up because to this day Sandy can't stand Denny. So I don't know what the issue was, unless it was familiarity breeding contempt.
Well, I don't know, but they both went to join Charlie at Capitol.
Columbia.
They both went to Charlie at Capitol, and they recorded several underground groups and had a number of poor recordings until Danny hit it big with another group I can't remember the name of them now, but
they had with Charlie arrangements, they had several attempts at hits with West Coast smaller groups.
Yeah,
there was a group from Portland, Oregon, Dawn and the Good Times,
and there was
Bambi.
They had a hit with the Bandwagon,
and a couple other ones that they had some minor hits with, but none of them were big hits. But they all had the Charlie Colello sound.
Well, Charlie Colello's sound is the most phenomenal orchestrations in the world. But in my opinion, and of course I would never say this to Charlie, in order to make a hit, you need Crew deciding how much of Charlie's orchestrations to use.
Yes, you're right.
Because Crew would say, "Go ahead, Kenny."
Yeah, they could overcome the performance.
Well, let's put it this way: the last album, Frankie Valli Romances the 60s, is really would be better served, and I know, Kenny, I've said this before, I don't know what, I don't think you agree with me, but would be better served to call it the Charlie Colello album, Charlie Colello Romances the 60s.
With guest vocalist Frankie Valli.
That's correct, with guest vocalist Frankie Valli, because there's no, Gaudio produced that, and there was no, Gaudio was going through, I was there, he was sitting and listening and being, you know, the star producer he is, but nobody was making any critical decisions. It was like, okay, Charlie, go do your thing. And I love Charlie, but Crew would have pulled out half of the instruments on those songs
Well,
with piano and just the high strings.
we want a specific discussion on Romancing the 60s at the end of,
Okay, we'll do that.
the, end of the box set, because it's in there along with a few other little things we would rather have discarded. But finishing this session at what was basically the breakup of the team, the man who stepped in to some extent to save the show was Artie Schrock, and he stepped in to cover for Charlie, and they were school friends, so
yes,
they knew each other well, and they knew each other's how each other worked, and so Artie was able to take the model that had been created and carry it through. And as we finish this session, we're finishing it on the thought that that is my question, and I raised it in posts I've done and the ebook I've done, is how would the Seasons compete when they lost their team? And we'll talk about that in the next session, and how Bob Gaudio fashioned a salvaging the Four Seasons.
Ken, can I add something to this if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Really quick. Just really quick.
There's no time. It's okay. You're okay.
Okay. This record here.
Yeah.
Look at the cover. Look at the title. It's 1966. The Beatles have Revolver out. The Beach Boys have Pet Sounds out. Bob Dylan has done Blonde on Blonde. There's a dialogue going on in rock and roll and pop music in general, because everything that happens after 65 kind of informs trends. I will go to my grave believing and saying how Phillips was completely inept in how to market a pop group. 1965, working my way back to you and more great new hits. Phillips is still marketing this group like it's 1962.
Yeah.
You know, they could hardly have been competition for the Beatles or anybody at that period, the way they were being marketed by their own label. So on top of lack of competition, there was a dialogue going on in pop music. And I mean, Lennon and McCartney were certainly aware of Brian Wilson, but I don't know how effective, you know, and this is a great record. I love this record.
Yeah. But
the way they were being marketed, again, I always said, like, they always had one foot in the past, and that's through no fault of their own. I believe that's lack of promotion with Phillips and just complete ineptitude on the part of their marketing.
Well, what we're going to talk about next time is the culmination of the departures, the lack of perception of what the Four Seasons could be, a bit of lack of direction internally because Crew was being distracted,
and a lack of, if I may, a lack of being able to admit how important each of the other people were. When someone would leave, it was like you couldn't leave without feeling, oh, good, next. And that wasn't the case for people like Colello, people like Linzer, people. Those are they a lot of times, Mike. A lot of times they succeeded in spite of the promotion, which is to their credit. And then a lot of times they failed because of their own inner ego, and that's just how I feel.
Yeah. They did very much reach a point where they were out of sync. The label was out of sync, and it needed a massive decision to change their direction and salvage what they could. And we'll talk about 1966 because it's pivotal. It affects everything that comes later in the 60s and leads to
it was also my bar mitzvah.
Was it? Well, congratulations on that.
I got a pen.
So thank you guys for all your contributions today. It's been great fun again. I've fed you back what I found. I'll probably remember a few things from that period that I haven't mentioned to you.
I doubt it.
But I just want the story as we've researched it and your comments and contributions to it to have come out. So thank you, everybody.
My pleasure. And Anthony, are you there?
Yes,
Your CDs are in the mail.
thank you. Your check is in the mail.
Okay, Lee. Thanks.
Thank you for letting me.
I believe they are more expensive than you can get in the supermarket. Is that correct?
They're as expensive as I'm allowed to sell them for.
Okay. Well, at least we know that CDs are not have not died out, and we can get.
Don't blink. Don't blink. CDs.
Get it on stream, Lee. Get it on stream.
I am. Anybody wants a link? It's for this group. Anything I do is free.
Well, Grant, thanks. I'm grateful for your contribution, and thanks to you all for taking part in this. So
Be
cheers.
well, everybody.
We'll
Till
finish
next time.
recording.
Stay well, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Keep enjoying life.
And you.